Mandy Boardman has always thought of herself as mature for her age. Even at 17 years old, she wasn't one to party or break the rules.
I was pretty responsible. I didn't really have time to be wild. I had a job, I had school, I played softball. I grew up a block away from the ball fields, and it was the place to be.
So in the spring of 1996, Mandy was excited to join a co-ed adult softball league within her close-knit Indianapolis community.
At 17, you become an adult when it comes to softball, so you have to join an adult league, and I decided that I would sub for a team, so I would get my fix.
Through the team, Mandy met all kinds of people,
Hey guys.
including 35-year-old David Wise.
Hi, my name's David. What's your name?
David worked at a shipping company, was a fine ball player, and seemed keen on offering Mandy extra support.
He was much older than me, but he was very nice to me and very polite. He would let me know how he appreciated me being there subbing for the team.
Good catch.
So when David made his true intentions known shortly after Mandy turned 18 by asking her out on a date, Mandy wasn't the least bit put off by their sizable age difference.
He just took me to a local Italian restaurant, and it was very quiet, nice. There was definitely an attraction there, and he always knew how to make me feel pretty and wanted.
Mandy and Dave were kind of an odd pairing, and it might have been because of the age difference. So to me, they were a little odd, but they seemed happy.
Unfortunately, not everyone was as thrilled as Mandy about her new boyfriend.
I was not a happy mommy, not happy at all. And I told her, I said, he is way too old for you. He could be your father. And she said, but he's not, you know, and I was like, well, he could be, so that makes him too old for you.
I always felt my mother was overprotective. It was very normal of her to be concerned about who I was dating, which probably made me want to date him even more.
Mandy knew her feelings for David were different, but she became concerned when she noticed the amount of alcohol he seemed to consume regularly.
I was not a drinker. I did not do that. So being around somebody who was always doing it was just very uncomfortable. So I did tell him, I'm okay if you drink a couple beers every now and then, but the hard stuff had to stop.
You've been drinking way too much.
And to her pleasant surprise, David completely listened to her request.
He stopped drinking. You know, he actually even stopped drinking beer. I felt if he's gonna quit drinking for me, this is gonna be great because he obviously wants to make me happy.
Within a year, it became obvious that marriage was in Mandy's near future.
David and I had spoken about marriage a couple times, and I said to myself, if I was going to get married, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be married forever.
That spring, Mandy wed David in a simple ceremony in front of family and friends, much to Mandy's mother's dismay.
It broke my heart because of the fact that I disliked him. I was really no part of it at all, none. And so I sat in the very last row, and I wore completely black.
It was not very encouraging, but I was in love with him, and we were going to get married, and not hell or high water was going to stop me.
But hell is exactly where Mandy would find herself. And when she slowly uncovered the layers of David's deceptions, it would become clear Mother does know best.
I almost lost my breath.
This is some pretty weird, sick stuff that's going on.
I was just so dumbfounded and shocked. I never thought something like this would happen to me.
In the spring of 1998, Mandy Wise was determined to prove to everyone that her marriage to new husband David was a success.
That's what you do. You get married and you're married forever.
Mandy's not a quitter. She will try to her last breath to keep right on going, and she wanted everything to work out.
And indeed, it seemed it would. When nearly 9 months to her wedding day, Mandy delivered a healthy baby boy. And 1 year later, she became pregnant again, this time with a daughter. But by the time their little girl was born in December 2001, Mandy noticed that David seemed to be falling back into an old habit.
The drinking had gotten to a point where it became more often. People around us started noticing and making comments.
He was more boisterous, more obnoxious. If he was awake, he pretty much had a beer in his hand.
Fine. Fantastic.
Mandy had no clue why David had suddenly gone back on his word to stop drinking and decided to confront him one evening.
What is wrong with you?
I tried to explain to David that not only was I not wanting to accept his drinking,
Promise me.
but I didn't want an alcoholic around my children.
You're so sick. I'm so sick of this.
I'm yelling at him. He's yelling back at me, and he smacked me. I was just so shocked. It was definitely a tipping point. He never apologized. And so from that point on, it seemed like arguments weren't just arguments. They were wars.
Soon, Mandy and David were arguing over everything.
David and I didn't have a very great, intimate relationship because I didn't want to do it.
You're so drunk and I don't want to sleep with you.
The attraction was gone, and he would just push and push and push, and so I would finally just be intimate so that we could get the argument over with and move on.
Mandy refused to admit defeat, so over the next few years, she did her best to ignore the husband-shaped elephant in the room. She started her own cleaning company and focused on her kids instead.
I think she wanted everybody to feel like she was in a good marriage. Most of us could see that it was a little rocky.
By 2005, with all Mandy had going on, she wasn't too alarmed when she began feeling incredibly groggy, even after getting a solid night's sleep.
I was finding myself in the middle of the day not being able to keep my eyes open. I couldn't figure out exactly what was going on with me.
There was many, many times that I called there at their house, and he would answer the phone. Well, she's asleep. I said, it's 4:30 in the afternoon. Why is she sleeping?
She's tired. She's been working hard.
But when Mandy began to wake up in the middle of the night with a strange taste in her mouth, she couldn't help but take notice.
It was very bitter, very strong taste that was like stuck there and wouldn't go away.
Mandy's mind landed on the only possible explanation she could muster.
We had a canopy over our bed, and I thought, well, maybe there are spiders up in there, and they're coming down, and they're jumping in my mouth.
It's gross.
I thought, this is crazy, but what else could it be? David never seemed very concerned. It was like, oh, well, you must be eating spiders.
Go back to sleep.
As the months went by, Mandy continued to feel exhausted. By Thanksgiving 2006, she was notably tired, but looking forward to the holiday.
My father was coming. I was very excited to be cooking for my whole family.
Mandy went to sleep that night feeling happy for the first time in a long time, until she suddenly awoke to a blinding sensation.
I was woken up to a light in my face. But I look, and then I see the light go away, and I watch my husband run away.
What are you doing?
I saw him on the other side of the bed stuffing some stuff underneath the mattress. I'm like, what's going on here?
What is that? Show me. What did you do?
In the fall of 2006, Mandy Wise woke up in a panic when she caught her husband suspiciously hiding something under the mattress.
And I'm like, what's going on here? What are you doing?
Mandy ran over to the other side of the bed and discovered what David had been concealing.
I found this vial and this dropper.
What is this?
The vial has a chalky-looking liquid in it. He pretty much just sat there in silence, like I was some kind of crazy person waking up in a rage.
You are overreacting.
Well, at this time, I had the taste in my mouth, the taste that I had before. So I asked, did you do this?
Have you been putting this in my mouth?
And he's avoiding everything that I'm asking him.
Mandy, you were acting crazy.
After hours of not getting anywhere with David, Mandy decided she needed space.
So I went across the street to Nicole's house to tell her what had happened.
She was crying. She didn't know what to do. I told her I didn't feel that that was right. I would be furious with my husband if he did that to me, because it was very evident he was drugging her. He was giving her something.
A few hours later, Mandy returned home, ready to face David.
I asked him what was in that vial, and he told me that he had crushed up some Xanax to help me sleep. I said, I don't understand why you're trying to help me sleep when I am already sleeping.
You've been giving me sleeping pills. I have been sleeping fine.
And he told me that this is what I needed.
That's why she'd been so tired and lethargic and sleeping so much. And, you know, above and beyond the fact that he did what he did, what if he gave her too much? I just couldn't believe he was doing that to her.
So Mandy made David promise to never take her health into his own hands again.
I just asked him to please kindly stop. He was like, okay, I'll stop.
Won't do it again.
You promised me.
After 8 years of marriage, Mandy wasn't sure what to think.
There were so many things that were going through my head, but I wanted to believe him. I wanted to make my marriage work, so I had to believe him.
So in the winter of 2007, when Mandy awoke to a familiar light shining in her face, she was completely distraught.
I had already been through this, and I felt like I knew what was going on, so I jump up immediately. Well, David takes off.
What are you hiding? Come back here.
Shocked by his audacity, Mandy chased David out to the garage.
Where is it?
I said, show me what's underneath the cushion. And he pulls out the vial and the dropper. I was so angry.
Mandy knew David had been drugging her yet again. The question was, why? As the young mother of 2 children, Mandy wasn't sure what to do next. For the next 3 months, she and David barely spoke as she tried to work out a plan in her head.
I didn't want my kids to know what happened. I had to figure out what was going on here.
But in the fall of 2008, the reason behind all the troubling events became clear.
I was home from work, and David had left his cell phone at home. So I decided I'm gonna go ahead and investigate. So I start looking through his phone, and I'm looking through texts and phone calls.
And the second Mandy opened his videos file, her heart stopped.
What I saw in the videos was nothing that I had ever expected to see in my entire life. It was horrible.
Oh my God.
Mandy didn't have much choice but to show the world what he really was.
In the fall of 2008, after discovering that her husband David had been drugging her in her sleep, Mandy Wise decided to have a look at the videos on his cell phone.
I found 3 videos. I
Oh my gosh.
saw David having sexual relations with me while I was sleeping. I looked like a corpse. It was horrible. It was almost like necrophilia. I thought, how in the world did this happen? I don't remember this.
Then it hit her. This was the reason he was drugging her.
I felt very angry. This whole time, he was lying to me, telling me that I need what he's giving me. Now I finally had proof that something seriously messed up was happening to me. I tried to send them to my email, and I couldn't figure it out on the phone. So I recorded the videos on the phone with the camcorder. That way I knew I had them.
When David arrived home, Mandy was quick to confront him.
His reaction was almost like no reaction. Like he wasn't surprised that they were there.
Mandy no longer doubted what she needed to do next. After 11 years of marriage, she filed for divorce and David moved out.
It was very hard to take that step to let everybody know that I failed and that my marriage didn't work and break apart my family. That's probably the hardest thing I've ever done. My kids. They were just devastated.
I thought he was sick and twisted, and I asked her, are you going to take this to the police? And she said, I don't think I can. I don't want anybody to know this. He's gone. It's done. This is not going to happen to me anymore.
By October 2009, Mandy and David's divorce was final. It was difficult for Mandy to acknowledge how wrong she'd been about David.
I feel like there's somewhere where David went off the grid, and people like that are capable of doing anything. And I thought if he could do this to his wife, then he could probably do it to anybody. So I decided to make the phone call to the Indianapolis Police Department.
David Wise was arrested in August 2011 and charged with 1 count of rape and 5 counts of deviant sexual behavior. Without physical evidence, however, he could not be charged with drugging Mandy. David pled not guilty, and on April 28, 2014, after 3 years of legal battles, he went to trial. Along with the video evidence, one of David's own friends testified against him.
David called the wife of one of his friends and made some statements that something was happening to Mandy while she was asleep.
The witness told the jury David said to her that he had no sex life with his wife and admitted to drugging her to have his way.
If she's not going to get it, I'm going to take it.
He explained to her that he would do it so that later he could watch the videos and enjoy them during his own time. It was just unfathomable.
Even David himself testified that he had given his wife drugs for 3 years.
He had been prescribed Xanax and Ambien on a number of different occasions. David said he was experiencing lapses in judgment due to drinking.
It was more than enough evidence, and 2 days later, David Wise was convicted on all charges. But much to Mandy's surprise, the judge imposed a light sentence, 20 years with 12 years suspended and 8 years in home detention with a GPS monitor.
I was devastated. This man was able to go home and lead his life. I was terrified.
You could have knocked me over with a feather. I was like, how can they do that?
The sentence he got was for people with limited or no criminal history. Did I agree with it? I didn't. Spousal rape is a very serious crime, and anytime an adult commits a crime like this, they need to be held accountable.
But 2 months after the sentencing, David failed to charge his GPS monitor for 6 hours.
They found him at home, and he claimed that his battery had just died.
The court found he had violated his home detention rules and revised his sentence to 5 years in prison and 3 years home detention.
I almost couldn't control myself because I just was so grateful for the peace. I felt like it was finally over.
Today, Mandy knows coming forward exposed the ugly truth in her marriage that she fought so hard to hide.
I feel like what I have done has brought attention to spousal rape. And now people are becoming more aware. Everybody needs to know that if you don't give consent, there is no consent.
With everything that she's had to do, I'm very proud of her for coming forward and saying, this is me. It happened to me. I'm very proud of her for that. It takes a lot of courage.
I never thought something like this would happen to me. But I'm definitely still strong-headed. And I want to make sure that whatever I do makes a difference.
In the summer of 1998, high school graduate Tabitha Howe was excited to strike out on her own, moving to a house with a great group of friends.
I worked right across the street at the restaurant, and we did what teenagers do. We all hung out, played video games, watched movies. We just had a good time.
But Tabitha's newest roommate, Scott Wellington, didn't seem to fit in.
Scott was working at a grocery store as a bagger, and at first I didn't like him. He was only 17, just a young kid who was arrogant.
Before long, Tabitha was pleased to see that Scott had a charming side.
He seemed like he was caring. He would notice, like, if I did my nails, which most men wouldn't notice. He picked up the house while we were at work. He seemed like a decent person. We just became very close.
Tabitha made it known she was interested in Scott, and they transitioned effortlessly from just friends into a couple.
I felt like maybe this could be something bigger. Maybe we could progress in our relationship and start building a life together. He was my first real love.
They got along well. They would also laugh at each other and tease each other. They were tickled to be together.
Over the next 2 years, Tabitha and Scott found a place of their own and spent every moment together.
We weren't rushing things. I felt I knew who he was. Everything was going pretty good.
But something was about to change all of that.
I found out I was pregnant. I was scared. I was really scared. I knew what it took to take care of a baby.
Tabitha wasn't sure how to tell Scott.
All right, sweetheart, I gotta go to work.
Okay, hon.
You all right? What's wrong?
I'm pregnant.
And he just stopped
What?
and just kind of froze, which made me panic a little.
Okay, you're pregnant. Let's do this thing.
But then he was like really excited about it. He genuinely seemed very happy. And he said he always wanted a family. And I think that Scott thought it was definitely going to be cake and just really fun, and I knew it wasn't like that at all.
9 months later, the young couple welcomed a baby boy.
Scott was a good dad. He was a really good dad. Tabitha was a very good mother. And she was happy, I was happy.
I never wanted kids. But once you hold your baby for the first time, there's nothing else that can take that place.
And by November of 2002, Tabitha had more surprising news for Scott.
I said, "You're going to be a daddy again." And he was absolutely thrilled. We already had one perfect little boy, and now we're going to have another baby.
To financially prepare, Tabitha found a job in the accounting department of a local store.
I was working nights, and Scott was working days. He went on to become a machinist, and he was making decent money. It was enough that we could get by.
But the excitement of another baby was soon eclipsed by a troubling new side of Scott.
Our son was learning to walk, and we had a small shelf up against the wall, and he grabbed onto it to steady himself, and it ended up falling on top of him. He was absolutely fine, but Scott got very angry.
Put this here.
I just thought he was being protective, but I'd never seen him really get angry before.
Then in March of 2003, life took a turn for the worse when Scott announced he'd been laid off from his job. For the next few months, Scott bounced from job to job, but nothing seemed to stick.
I would pick up any available shifts at work, but he did not do anything. He didn't do the dishes, he didn't pick up the house. He was very reluctant to actually get a job and just make some money to help out.
She was very frustrated by, always having to clean up whatever mess that was there.
Finally, in July 2003, in time for the arrival of their second son, Scott found another good job as a machinist in Greenville, just across the New Hampshire state line.
He seemed really happy. He seemed to get a little bit of that spark back and talking like things are going to get better.
But Tabitha would soon learn that with every new high came an unbearable low.
It was a roller coaster ride. I was really scared.
And gradually, Tabitha would be swept into a whirlwind of deception so shocking she wondered if she would even survive.
I was stunned. I couldn't quite wrap my head around what had happened.
You see this stuff in books and TV shows, you don't think it's going to happen to you.
In July 2003, after giving birth to their second son, Tabitha Howe was relieved when her boyfriend Scott Wellington landed a promising new job as a machinist in the quaint town of Greenville.
Greenville, it seemed nice and quiet. It's a small little town. We found a cute little 2-bedroom apartment. It was so close to the post office. We were told we had to get a post office box because the mail delivery service would not deliver our mail. Scott always had the keys with him, and he would always get the mail.
With an additional mouth to feed, the couple began pulling long hours at work to support their growing family. And the stress of rarely seeing each other began to take its toll.
We were kind of like ships passing in the night. It put up a lot of barriers in between us. During Christmas, I would work until midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and he would accuse me of being out cheating on him.
Where have you been?
I was at work.
It got to the point where I would have to print out the times that I punched in at work and punched out. I felt like Scott wanted to have complete control over me.
Tabitha was sad, you know, and she just didn't know how to prove to him that she wasn't with other men.
Don't walk away from me.
Tabitha didn't know what to make of this new side to Scott. But even more surprising, one day that December, Scott completely blindsided her.
Scott talked about getting married. It was not something that I have ever wanted. It's just a piece of paper to me. But that's what he wanted. He wanted a real family. So he went and got a ring.
Will you marry me?
Wow.
We had 2 kids. Obviously, this was something that was long-term.
Yeah.
But we never set a date. We just stayed engaged, and I think it was really more in his mind than anything.
And after giving birth to a daughter in 2005, and then another little girl in 2009, it seemed their family was complete.
I knew I didn't want any more kids. 4 was more than enough. Scott was fine with that. It seemed like things were getting a lot better.
Then Scott arrived home one day early from work and dropped a bombshell.
Why are you home from work so early?
I quit.
I was just dumbfounded. And I said, "What do you mean you quit? How are we going to support the kids?"
You know we need the health insurance.
I know that. Just get off my back about it.
It turned into a big fight, and he yelled and he screamed.
As Tabitha took on more hours at work, she struggled to understand why, out of the blue, Scott tossed his family into yet another financial storm. It wasn't until January of 2010 when Tabitha showed Scott a listing for a machinist job at a local company called C&M that he finally took action.
It seemed like a really great company. He called them. He went down for an interview. They ended up hiring him.
Tabitha hoped their troubles were finally behind them. But they were just getting started when Scott made a horrifying decision that would not only devastate Tabitha, but would betray his entire company.
He just sounded like he wanted to destroy her.
I was terrified. He was a completely different person.
In 2010, Tabitha Howe was thrilled when her fiancé, Scott Wellington, landed a solid job, one that enabled him to support their 4 young children, ages 1 through 9. But despite Scott making good money, he seemed to grow more irritable by the day.
We can't afford more than one line.
And before long, his controlling streak returned with a vengeance.
Scott, I really need a phone.
Scott got the home phone shut off, and that's when he really started to isolate me from everybody.
I got her another cell phone, and I paid the bill. He was not happy about that because there was nothing he could do.
And though Scott wanted more control, He didn't seem to want to spend more time with Tabitha and the kids.
He would get up really early and say he was going to work, like 3 o'clock in the morning.
Okay, thank you.
One time, I brought him to work, and I said, we'll have lunch with you. We'll have a little picnic outside. Oh, no, you can't bring the kids there. There could be metal scraps in the yard.
It'd be dangerous for the kids.
He made it sound like it was concern for the kids.
Then, in December 2010, just in time for the holidays, the pendulum swung again.
I have a little bit of a surprise for you.
He came home and he just started pulling money out of his pockets. And he said that he got a $3,000 bonus from work. I said, really? He said, I helped them get a really big contract. It was fabulous. So I was like, well, it's gonna be a really good Christmas for the kids.
But when Christmas Eve finally rolled around, Scott had plans of his own.
Hey, sweetheart, I think I'm gonna take off and hang out with the guys for a little bit.
Okay, that's fine.
I said, just don't be too late because, we have a lot to do. He was like, okay, he gave me a kiss. He left.
Boom! Gotcha.
Tabitha and I were online playing a game. It was just sort of a way to pass the time.
When Scott returned home later that night, it was clear something other than the holiday spirit had possessed him.
I was sitting on the computer, I was chatting with Emmy, and Scott stormed back into the house, just in a rage, just angry, yelling.
I know what you've been doing.
He started to accuse me of cheating again.
You want her? You know what anger.
And then he picked me up and threw me across the living room.
You could hear the physical tussle. You knew a physical altercation was going on. The microphone just sort of hit the desk with a thump. And then it just went silent. So I sat there sort of stunned and immediately started trying to call her.
I was scared. I was really scared. Now all the kids are out of bed. I said, I'm calling the police. He took off. I was terrified, and I called my mom.
She called me, crying, and said that he just went off the deep end, and he had just left on foot. She asked me to come up there, and I did.
She finally texted me. She was okay, that her mom was on the way, and that he had left.
Tabitha struggled to understand what had prompted the attack. But when Scott returned later that night, apparently calmed down, Tabitha let him stay.
He seemed legitimately sorry for what had happened.
I'm so sorry.
I didn't really want him back in the house, but it was Christmas Eve. I couldn't let him ruin Christmas for the kids. It's supposed to be a magical time, not the day your father leaves.
But soon what happened that Christmas would be the least of Tabitha's worries when her life took another dramatic turn, one that would end with a chilling discovery.
He's devious, crooked, he's a sociopath.
There's a very small percentage of people that are just absolutely evil. It shocked me.
I was terrified, and I thought, was this his plan all along?
On Christmas Eve 2010, Tabitha Howe was suddenly attacked by her partner of 12 years, Scott Wellington. But she allowed him to come back home, if only for the sake of their 4 young children.
Scott was very quiet when he came back. He seemed legitimately sorry for what had happened, but he never offered an explanation. I made the decision that night that things were completely over between the two of us, and I just needed to figure out what the next step was.
No, Evan, do not touch me.
And 3 months later, in March 2011, Tabitha couldn't take it any longer.
It's over.
We had a really big fight. Everything just came out. I just couldn't handle it anymore. I was all done. I just needed him gone. I threw him out.
Over the next month, Tabitha wanted nothing to do with Scott, but with the children, it wasn't possible.
Scott was supposed to come and see the kids for Easter, and we had agreed upon that.
As Tabitha prepared for the visit, she kept busy by running a few errands.
I was going to the grocery store, and I stopped to get the mail.
Getting the mail had always been Scott's job. So when Tabitha opened their P.O. box, she was floored at the number of unpaid bills. But it was what she found in another envelope that tore her world apart.
There was a card in there, and I figured it's from my grandparents to the kids. I didn't think anything of it, so I opened it up, and it's a sympathy card with some money orders in it. And I start reading it. Dear Scott, we're so sorry for the loss of your wife. You and your kids are in our prayers. I'm like, who is this for? You know, they must have made a mistake. Somebody sent this to the wrong address. I have no idea what's going on. But then I kind of started to wonder, was Scott planning on killing me? Was this his plan all along? I was terrified. Why would he tell people I was dead? I called Scott. I said, don't come and see the kids. Don't come to my house. Don't come anywhere near me.
The following Monday morning, Tabitha spoke with Scott's boss, who was surprised to see her alive and well. As they discussed the circumstances surrounding the card, Tabitha learned the situation was far worse than she imagined. Not only had Scott told his colleagues she'd passed away, he had done so after weaving a year-long tragic tale about a mythical battle with cancer.
Scott told them that I had been diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer and that I was getting sicker and sicker by the day. He then told them that I had to have a double mastectomy and that it wasn't looking good.
In turn, his company had given Scott almost $7,000 in donations to help offset the mounting medical costs, plus several weeks of paid time off. Right around the time Tabitha kicked him out, Scott told his company that she had died.
Certain things started to make sense. He didn't want me to go out. He didn't want me to be seen by people. He didn't want me to bring the kids to work for lunch because I was supposedly sick at home, withering away and dying. He wanted to have complete control over me and isolate me.
That day, Tabitha got a restraining order against Scott, while Scott's boss contacted police and pressed charges.
The owner of the company explained to me he had to report a theft, and the story of the theft was bizarre, to say the least. I had Scott come in for an interview, and he didn't try to lie or deny anything that had happened. He painted the picture that the family was hard on times, and he was trying to make ends meet as best he could. That was his motivation.
Never supposed to get to this level.
Scott was charged with 2 counts of theft by deception, one for the amount of $5,000 and $2,000 for previous donations.
I knew about the $3,000 that he had gotten at Christmas, but the other money I knew nothing about. I don't know exactly what he was doing with it.
On May 16, 2011, Scott accepted a deal and pled guilty to 1 count of theft by deception, claiming he needed the money to support his family.
I don't believe anything that comes out of his mouth. He says he did it to support his family. But we didn't see that money.
Scott only spent a few days in jail and was placed on administrative probation.
I realize he didn't kill anybody, but he took advantage of people. I think he should have gone away for a while. I do.
It's absolutely ridiculous. These people were trying to help somebody out who they thought was having a difficult time, and he didn't care. That's sick. Absolutely just sick.
Today, Tabitha still struggles to understand how and why her teenage love turned into such a master manipulator.
Scott was very smart in the way that if he lied to you, he could remember that. And he would continue with that lie for as long as it took. And thinking about not getting married, that was definitely when I knew I made the right choice.
As time passed, Tabitha tried to move beyond all the hurt and devastation Scott caused. She focuses on being a survivor.
Tabitha is fantastic. She's doing very well with the kids. The kids are all good. Every day she gets better and better.
He tried to destroy me, but I'm back to who I originally was, and I believe I'm stronger for it. I have a full-time job. I take care of my kids. I can do this on my own.
The tea was still warm on the mahogany side table when the silence of number 42, Blackwood Drive, became permanent. It is a chilling truth of the human psyche that we fear the dark woods and the hooded stranger, yet we ignore the creak of a floorboard in the house next door. In the autumn of 1985, London wasn't just a city of fog and red buses. It was a city of paranoia. Mary Higgins, a 62-year-old librarian known for her punctuality and her penchant for red roses, did not show up for her shift at the Southwark Library. This was the first domino to fall in a tragedy that will haunt the British Metropolitan Police for nearly 4 decades. When officers kicked in the door, they didn't find a ransacked home or a struggle of epic proportions. They found a chillingly domestic scene, except for the trail of blood that led from the kitchen to the basement stairs. There was no forced entry, no broken glass, no signs of a fight, just Mary, gone, and a single, smeared bloody fingerprint on a porcelain tea saucer. The neighborhood was paralyzed. How does a woman vanish from a locked house in broad daylight? The headlines screamed the ghost of Southwark, and the community retreated behind double-locked doors, never realizing that the predator wasn't lurking in the shadows of the alleyway, but was watching the police tape from the window of the house right beside them. For 38 years, this file sat in a dusty cabinet, a cold case that mocked the detectives who inherited it. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, a single bouquet of red roses appears on the doorstep of the now vacant house. The police watched, they waited, they DNA tested the wrappers, but the trail was a graveyard of dead ends. The mystery became a local legend, the kind of story whispered to children to keep them from talking to strangers. But the stranger wasn't a stranger. That is the shockwave that hit London this morning. As forensic technology finally caught up to the cruelty of 1985, the microscopic ghosts left on that porcelain saucer began to speak. Using advanced genetics, investigators didn't find a career criminal or a wandering drifter. They found a family tree that led straight back to the very street where Mary lived. The realization was a physical blow to the lead investigator. The DNA profile matched a man who had been interviewed 6 times in 1985, a man who had offered the search parties coffee, a man who had comforted Mary's grieving sister, a man who had lived at number 44, Blackwood Drive, for 40 years. The arrest of Arthur Penhaligon, now 81 years old, has sent a tremor through the heart of the city. Neighbors who knew him as Old Artie, the man who trimmed his hedges with precision surgery and always had a treat for the local dogs, watched in stunned silence as he was led away in handcuffs. The image is jarring. A frail man in a cardigan, his eyes vacant, being charged with a crime so visceral it defined a generation of fear. The investigation now reveals a terrifying reality of hiding in plain sight. In 1985, the police were looking for a monster, but they were talking to a neighbor. Arthur hadn't fled. He hadn't changed his name. He hadn't even changed his routine. He had simply sat in his garden, year after year, watching the world move on from a crime he had committed in 20 minutes of madness. The cold case wasn't cold to him. It was a living, breathing part of his daily life. Every time a new neighbor moved in, every time a child played near the fence, he was there. The silent guardian of a dark secret buried beneath the floorboards of his own basement. As the forensic teams move into number 44, the atmosphere is heavy with the scent of damp earth and old wood. They aren't just looking for evidence. They are looking for Mary. The community stands behind the police cordons, a sea of pale faces and hushed voices. There is a collective sense of betrayal that transcends the crime itself. It's the realization that evil doesn't always look like a villain. Sometimes, it looks like the man who collects your mail when you're on vacation. The shocking arrest isn't just about justice for Mary Higgins. It's about the shattering of a 40-year-old illusion of safety. The investigators are meticulously peeling back the layers of Arthur's life, finding a man obsessed with control, a man who keeps a meticulous diary of the police investigation as it unfolds in real time. He wasn't just a killer. He was a spectator of his own infamy. He recorded the names of the detectives, the dates of the newspaper articles, and the reactions of the neighbors. He lived within the heartbeat of the tragedy, fueled by the very fear he had created. The details emerging from the interrogation room are the stuff of nightmares. Arthur speaks in a calm, detached tone, as if discussing the weather. He describes the afternoon of the murder with a chilling lack of remorse. He recounts how he saw Mary through the window, how he knew the back door was always left unlocked for the milkman, and how he stepped across the threshold of his neighbor's life and ended it without a word. The strange clues that baffled police for decades, like the missing library book and the misplaced garden shears, were trophies he kept in a shoebox under his bed. For 38 years, he slept above the proof of his guilt. The mysterious disappearance was never a mystery to him. It was his masterpiece. The cold case wasn't a puzzle to be solved. It was a memory he revisited every time he looked out his kitchen window at the house next door. The psychological impact on the survivors is immeasurable. Mary's niece, now a woman in her 50s, remembers Arthur giving her sweets during the funeral. The betrayal is a poison that seeps into the past, rewriting every memory of the last 4 decades. Every neighborhood gathering, every Christmas card exchange, every hello over the garden fence is now tainted by the shadow of a predator. The communal shock is a visceral, aching thing. People are looking at their own neighbors today with new, suspicious eyes. If Arthur could do this, who else is hiding a body behind a smile? The city feels smaller, tighter, more dangerous. The resolution of the case hasn't brought peace. It has brought a terrifying clarity. We are never truly alone, and we never truly know who is living on the other side of the wall. As the sun sets over Southwark, the lights of the police vans flicker against the brickwork of Blackwood Drive. The excavation of Arthur's basement continues into the night. They have found the red roses, not real ones, but silk flowers, hundreds of them, stored in crates. A macabre tribute to the woman he destroyed. The DNA reveals killer headline is just the beginning of a much darker story about the capacity for human deception. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of proximity. The proximity of a killer to his victim, the proximity of a lie to the truth, and the proximity of our darkest fears to our everyday lives. The cold case is solved, the handcuffs are on, but the haunting of London has only just begun. The echoes of 1985 are no longer whispers. They're a deafening roar of a truth that was always right there, hiding in the house next door. The excavation of the basement at number 44 did not stop at the silk roses. It was merely the opening of a tomb. As the jackhammers bit into the concrete, a suffocating silence fell over the gathered crowd outside. This is the reality of a cold case brought to life. It is never just about one person, one moment, or one grave. It is an archaeological dig into human depravity. The forensic team, draped in white Tyvek suits that glowed like ghosts under the floodlights, began to pull more than just physical evidence from the earth. They pulled out a timeline of a life lived in the shadow of a corpse. Every bucket of dirt carried out of that house felt like a heavy weight being placed on the chest of the community. People who had lived on Blackwood Drive for 30 years were now questioning every interaction they ever had with Arthur. They remembered him helping them carry groceries. They remembered him waving as they drove to work. The monster next door wasn't a monster in their memories. He was a fixture of the landscape. And that is the true horror of the London 1985 case. The seamless integration of a killer into the mundane rhythm of suburban life. The deeper the police dug, the more the perfect neighbor facade crumbled into a heap of chilling contradictions. Investigators discovered a hidden crawl space behind a false wall in the pantry, a space that hadn't been touched since the mid-'80s. Inside was a meticulously kept archive. This wasn't just a shoebox of trophies. It was a shrine to Mary Higgins. There were photographs taken of her through her own windows, grainy, black and white images of a woman reading, drinking tea, living a life unaware that she was being documented by a predator from 10 yards away. The level of obsession was staggering. Arthur hadn't just killed her. He had consumed her life before he ever laid a hand on her. The DNA that linked him to the tea saucer was the key that unlocked a door to a psychological labyrinth. How does a man live for 40 years with the knowledge that he is a ghost in his own neighborhood? How does he look at the police officers investigating the crime and offer them a glass of water without his hand shaking? The answer lies in a chilling lack of empathy that experts are now calling the ultimate camouflage. As the news of the archive spread, the shocking community aspect of the headline took on a new, darker meaning. Other families who had lived in Southwark in the 80s began to come forward with stories of their own Matt Titchbian. Cold case files that had been dormant for decades were suddenly being pulled from the archives and stacked on the desks of the task force. The name Arthur Penhaligon started appearing in the margins of old police reports. He was a witness in a 1982 disappearance. He was a person of interest in a 1988 assault that was eventually dropped for lack of evidence. The single strand of DNA had opened a floodgate. It wasn't just Mary. The realization hit the city like a physical blow. Arthur wasn't a one-time killer who snapped. He was a silent predator who had operated in the heart of London for years, protected by his age, his skin color, and his impeccable garden. He was the man who was too normal to be a suspect. In the interrogation room, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the chaotic activity at the crime scene. Arthur sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the metal table, his expression one of polite boredom. He didn't ask for a lawyer initially. He wanted to talk. He wanted to explain the logic of his actions. This is the part of the voiceover where the music drops to a low, pulsing hum, a sound that vibrates in the back of the skull. Arthur's voice, captured on police tape, is thin and reedy, but steady. He speaks about Mary not as a human being, but as a disruption that needed to be managed. He talks about the 1985 investigation with a sense of professional pride, pointing out the mistakes the police made, mocking the detectives who are long since retired or dead. "You were looking for a wolf," he reportedly told the lead investigator. "But you forgot that wolves have to live somewhere. They have to have addresses. They have to pay their taxes." The psychological profile emerging is that of a collector. Arthur didn't just collect silk roses or photographs. He collected the grief of others. He admitted to attending Mary's memorial service, not out of guilt, but to watch the way her sister's hands trembled when she held the prayer book. He fed on the vacuum he created. This is the chandon that the headlines can't fully capture. The idea that the person comforting you at your lowest moment is the very person who put you there. It's a level of sociopathy that defies the standard narrative of crimes of passion. This was a crime of calculation, a 40-year game of chess where the opponent didn't even know they were playing. The community of Southwark is now a crime scene in its entirety. Every house is a potential witness. Every memory a potential piece of evidence. The trauma is being relived, but this time, it's stripped of the mystery and replaced with a sickening clarity. The strange plot began to surface in the local tabloids, details that the police had kept under wraps to protect the integrity of the case. They found a diary entry from October 14th, 1985, the day after Mary disappeared. It simply read, "The garden is quiet now. The roses are redder than I expected." This sentence has become a focal point for the media, a haunting mantra that summarizes the cold-blooded nature of the crime. The public is obsessed with the why. But Arthur offers no satisfying answer. He killed because he could. He stayed because he enjoyed the view. The DNA reveals Killer's story is evolving into a saga of a serial offender who uses the anonymity of a crowded city to hide his darkest impulses. The investigation is now spanning multiple decades, looking for any trace of Arthur in every unsolved disappearance within a 10-mile radius of Blackwood Drive. As the second day of the search at number 44 began, the police brought in ground-penetrating radar. The tension was palpable. If he lived there for 40 years, what else is under the concrete? The cold case has transformed into a potential killing field. The neighbors who once defended Arthur, calling him a sweet old soul, are now barricaded in their homes, forced to speak to the press. The shame of having been so close to such evil for so long is a heavy burden. They feel like accomplices in their ignorance. The stalemate of the last 38 years wasn't a failure of the police alone. It was a failure of the collective instinct. We are taught to trust our neighbors, to look out for each other, but the case of Arthur Penhaligon teaches a different, more cynical lesson. The person you trust the most is the one who knows exactly where you're vulnerable. The narrative of the cold case solving is usually one of closure, but here, it is an opening of a wound. Mary's remaining family members are in a state of shock that prevents any sense of relief. For them, the killer wasn't a monster in the woods. He was Uncle Artie, who brought over a fruitcake every Christmas. The betrayal is total. It is a theft of their history. They are looking back at 40 years of family photos, and in the background of a birthday party or a summer barbecue, they see him. There he is, standing by the fence, smiling for the camera, while Mary's body lies just a few yards away. The shocking feeling is not just about the murder. It is about the longevity of the lie. How does a human heart hold that much darkness for that long without cracking? Arthur Penhaligon didn't crack. He thrived. The script of this tragedy is still being written with every shovelful of dirt. The fast, furious pace of the news cycle is struggling to keep up with the scale of the discovery. Forensic analysis are working around the clock, comparing Arthur's DNA to national databases, looking for matches in cases from the 70s, the 80s, even the 90s. They are looking for the stranger in the fog and finding the man in the garden. The open mystery of Mary Higgins is solved, but 1,000 other questions have taken its place. Who was Arthur Penhaligon before he moved to Blackwood Drive? What happened in the years when the roses weren't blooming? The echo of the case is a haunting melody that plays over the rooftops of London tonight, a reminder that the past is never truly dead. It's just waiting for the right technology to dig it up. The final image of this chapter of the investigation is one of haunting symmetry. In the basement of number 44, the police found a mirror. It was positioned in such a way that if you stood in the center of the room, you could see the reflection of Mary's kitchen window next door. Arthur had spent 40 years looking into that mirror, watching the life he had stolen, watching the house change owners, watching the world go on without the woman he killed. He was a man who lived in a reflection. He was a man who lived in the gap between what we see and what we know. The DNA reveals killer is the headline, but the story is about the mirror. It's about the things we refuse to see, even when they're staring us right in the face. The forensic teams at number 44, Blackwood Drive, began to realize that the basement wasn't just a burial site. It was a museum of the mundane turned macabre. As they moved into the third day of the investigation, the cold case label felt increasingly unstable. This wasn't a static memory of 1985. It was a living, evolving gallery of a predator's patience. Every floorboard pulled up reveals more than just structural timber. They found stacks of old newspapers, all dated from the week of Mary's disappearance, preserved in airtight plastic sleeves as if they were holy relics. Arthur hadn't just committed a crime. He had curated its aftermath. He was the primary consumer of the terror he had sowed. A man who feasted on the public shock. He testified from his front porch. The investigators were no longer just looking for bone fragments. They were trying to map the psyche of a man who could sleep soundly, while the world outside screamed for answers he held in his pocket. The strange phenomenon began to take on a digital dimension as forensic IT specialists joined the team. Despite his age, Arthur had been an early adopter of home computing. In the back of a closet, Buried under layers of moth-eaten cardigans, they found a series of ancient floppy disks and early model hard drives. When the data was finally extracted, it revealed a digital ledger of obsession. He had kept spreadsheets meticulous, cold, and calculated of every police officer who had ever knocked on his door. He had logged their badge numbers, their names, and even personal details he'd overheard. Detective Miller's wife is pregnant. Officer Smith has a cold. This was a man who had reversed the roles of the hunter and the hunted. He was investigating the police while they were investigating him. The DNA reveals killer. Headline was a technological triumph, but the files on those disks revealed a human failure of staggering proportions. Arthur had stayed one step ahead not by being a genius, but by being invisible through sheer, boring normalcy. The atmosphere in London grew more claustrophobic as the open mystery of other cases began to merge with the Blackwood Drive investigation. The task force, now operating out of a dedicated command center in New Scotland Yard, begins connecting Arthur to a series of mysterious disappearances across the greater London area from 1979 to 1995. The pattern was always the same: proximity. He never hunted far from where he lived or worked. He was a creature of habit, and his habit was the quiet destruction of those within his immediate orbit. The shock wasn't just local anymore. It was national. Every suburb in England has an old Artie, a quiet neighbor who keeps to himself and tends his garden. The realization that such a figure could be a prolific killer was a blow to the very fabric of British social trust. The cold case was no longer a tragedy of the past. It was a warning for the present. In the interrogation room, the power dynamic was shifting. Arthur, sensing the mounting evidence, began to play a psychological game with the detectives. He didn't just confess. He lectured. He spoke about the fragility of the social contract with a chilling, academic detachment. He told the investigators that they only caught him because the machines got smarter, not the men. He took pleasure in pointing out the moments where he had almost been caught, like the time he had to move Mary's car in the middle of the night while a patrol car circled the block. He described the adrenaline of that moment with a glint in his eyes that disenchanted even the most seasoned homicide detectives. This was the sensational reality of the case. The killer was enjoying the spotlight. He was finally getting the recognition for his perfect crime that he had craved for nearly 40 years. The news media was in a frenzy. The DNA reveals killer lived next door story was the top trend on every social media platform, with true crime enthusiasts and amateur sleuths dissecting every frame of the news footage. They analyzed the way Arthur walked, the way he looked at the camera, trying to find the tell that everyone had missed for 4 decades. But there was no telling. That was the most mysterious part of all. He was a blank slate. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no psychodynamic red flags. He was a man who had decided one day to kill, and then decided every day after that to keep living as if nothing had happened. This flow of normalcy was his greatest weapon. It was a shield that no traditional investigation could pierce. As the ground-penetrating radar continued its slow crawl across Arthur's backyard, it hit a significant anomaly near the old oak tree on the property line. The digging stopped and the fast, pounding beat of the news crews outside reached a fever pitch. The concussion was about to escalate. Beneath the roots of that tree, they didn't find Mary Higgins. They found the remains of someone else entirely. A young man, estimated to have been in his early 20s, missing since 1981. The scope of the cold case had just doubled. The monster in the mirror wasn't just a neighbor. He was a graveyard keeper. The community's reaction transitioned from shock to a profound, sickening horror. The street wasn't just a place where a murder happened. It was a site of systematic, long-term preparation. The witness, who had lived on the street back in the 80s, were brought in for new rounds of questioning. They were asked to remember things they had long since suppressed. A strange smell in the summer of '81. A light on in Arthur's basement at 3 a.m. A car they didn't recognize idling in the driveway. The guilt these people felt was palpable in their statements. "I should have known." was the common refrain. But how could they? Arthur had mastered the art of being part of the furniture. He was as unremarkable as a lamppost or a curb. This is the shocking feeling that lingers, the terrifying possibility that we are all living next to an Arthur Penhaligon, and we're just waiting for the DNA to catch up with them. The investigation into the second body revealed a connection that was even more personal. The victim was a former apprentice of Arthur's when he worked as a master carpenter. The strange story of the 1981 disappearance had always pointed to a workplace accident or a runaway youth. But now the truth is laid bare in the dirt. Arthur had used his position of authority to lure the vulnerable into his trap. The mystery of his life was being stripped away layer by layer, revealing a predatory instinct that was as consistent as it was cruel. The DNA reveals killer was the spark, but the resulting fire was consuming everything Arthur had built. As night fell on the 5th day of the investigation, the police began to move crates of evidence out of the house. Among them were hundreds of cassette tapes. Arthur had recorded the sounds of the neighborhood for 40 years. The birds, the lawnmowers, the children playing, and the screams that no one else heard. He had created a library of ambient terror, a soundtrack to his own secret life. The voiceover of his existence was a mix of the ordinary and the unthinkable. This is the emotional climax of the story. The realization that while the neighbors were living their lives, Arthur was recording their demise. He was a historian of the horrors he created, a man who lived in the silence between the heartbeats of his victims. The script of the London 1985 cold case was no longer just about Mary Higgins. It was a saga of a city's lost innocence. The echo of the case was a cold wind blowing through the streets of Southwark, carrying the weight of 40 years of lies. Arthur Penhaligon sat in his cell, a frail old man with a heart of stone, watching the clock. He knew that his time was up, but he also knew that he had won. He had lived his life. He had stayed in his house. He had held his roses. The cold case solved was his final act, the moment he finally allowed the world to see the masterpiece he had hidden behind the garden fence. The shock will fade. The news will move on. But for the people of Blackwood Drive, the mirror will always show a monster. The hiss of the cassette tapes was the first thing the forensic audio team heard, a low-frequency static that felt like the breathing of the house itself. As Part 4 of the investigation unfolded, the strange nightmares transitioned from physical trophies to auditory nightmares. Arthur Penhaligon hadn't just watched his neighbors. He had eavesdropped on the very soul of the street. Investigators found that he had wired number 44 with a series of high-sensitivity microphones. Some even extended through the brickwork to the shared walls of Mary Higgins's home. The cold case wasn't a silent memory. It was a recorded archive. The detectives sat in a darkened room at New Scotland Yard, headphones pressed tight, listening to the ghost of Mary Higgins. They heard the clink of her teacup, the muffled sound of her radio playing a BBC broadcast from October 1985, and then the heavy, rhythmic thud of a door being opened by someone who didn't belong. The shock in that room was absolute. They were listening to a murder in slow motion. 40 years later, the heart of the victim had stopped beating. The fast-paced, intense of the interrogation intensified as the lead detective, a veteran named Sarah Collins, confronted Arthur with the recordings. She didn't lead with questions. She simply pressed play. Arthur's reaction wasn't fear, it was nostalgia. He closed his eyes, a faint, terrifying smile playing on his thin lips, as if he were listening to a favorite symphony. She always liked the radio too loud. He whispered into the sterile air of the interview room. This was the sensational moment that leaked to the press. The killer who kept the voices of his victims as a bedtime story. The DNA reveals killer headline was being eclipsed by a new, more horrifying narrative of the listener Southwark. The public's obsession shifted from the how to the how long. How long can a human being sustain a life built on the sounds of death? Outside on Blackwood Drive, the ground-penetrating radar had moved to the garage. The open mystery of the 1981 apprentice was just the beginning. The radar began to ping again, rhythmic and insistent, indicating more anomalies beneath the oil-stained concrete. The shock reached a fever pitch as the jackhammers returned. This time, they find a metal box, welded shut. Inside were no bodies, but the mysterious disappearance of a dozen local pets, collars, tags, and small bones. Dating back to the late 70s, it was a textbook escalation. Arthur had been practicing his perfect crime on the neighborhood's animals before he ever moved to marry Higgins. The community shock deepened as people realized the quiet old man had been a predator in their midst for nearly half a century. Every missing cat, every dog that never came home, was a footprint on Arthur's path to Mary's kitchen. The flow of the investigation was now a torrent. Forensic accountants discovered that Arthur had been paying for a small storage unit in East London under a shell company for 35 years. When the tactical teams breached the unit, they found a room that was a mirror image of Mary Higgins's living room. He had reconstructed her environment with identical furniture, identical wallpaper, and even the same books on the shelves. This wasn't just obsession. It was a total displacement of reality. Arthur didn't want to just kill Mary. He wanted to be near her forever. The cold case solved was revealing the level of psychological fragmentation that makes the monster next door label feel like an understatement. He was a man who lived in a museum of his own making, a curator of a life he had extinguished. The media coverage became a shock of its own, with breaking news banners flashing across every screen in the United Kingdom. The DNA reveals killer lived next door story was now being compared to the most prolific serial killers in British history. But Arthur was different. He denies the chaos of a Ripper or the grandiosity of a West. He was the banality of evil personified. He was the man who paid his council tax on time. He was the man who complained about the trash collection. This motif of the invisible killer became a national trauma. If the man next door can build a shrine to your murder while helping you carry your bags, who can be trusted? The mystery of the human neighbor became the most terrifying question of the year. During the interrogation, Arthur began to talk about the transition. He described the moment Mary died not as a violent act, but as a merger. He believed that by taking her life and keeping her sounds, he had achieved a form of immortality. The strange growth of the silk roses finally made sense. They were the only things that wouldn't die. Unlike the flesh and blood he couldn't keep. His reedy voice, captured on the police tapes, speaks of the beauty of the cold. He views the 1985 cold case not as a failure of justice, but as a success of preservation. You only found her because I let you. He challenged Detective Collins. The DNA was always there. I just stopped cleaning the saucer. This revelation sent a shiver through the department. Was he confessing? Or was he playing his final move in a game he had already won? The witnesses from the 1980s were now being hounded by the paparazzi, their lives appended by the ghost of a neighbor they thought they knew. One elderly woman, who had lived across from Arthur for 40 years, suffered a heart attack shortly after the DNA reveals killer news broke. The echo of the case was literally killing people. The community was disintegrating under the weight of the truth. The local pub, where Arthur used to sit in the corner and drink a single pint of bitter every Friday, was forced to close its doors as it became a site of macabre tourism. The impasse of the past was replaced by a devastation of the present. The fourth part of this nightmare concludes with a discovery that shifts the investigation's focus yet again. Inside the welded box in the garage, tucked beneath the animal collars, was a photograph. It wasn't of Mary. It was a photo of a young woman in a 1970s nurse's uniform, standing in front of a hospital in Manchester. On the back, in Arthur's precise, architectural handwriting, were the words. The first one, 1974, the one who taught me to listen. The cold case had just left the borders of London. The fast, furious pace of the narrative was now a race against time and geography. How many cities had Arthur lived in? How many basements had he dug? How many mirrors were reflecting his crimes across the country? The sensation of shock was no longer a local shock. It was a national emergency. The DNA reveals killer was the key. But the door it opened led to a hallway that seemed to go on forever. Arthur Penhaligon sat in his cell. The light from the corridor reflected in his glasses, looking like nothing more than a tired old man. But in his mind, the tapes were still playing. The screams were still fresh, and the roses were still red. The flow of his evil was a river that had been flowing underground for 40 years, and the world was finally drowning in it. The emotional climax of Part 4 was the realization that Mary Higgins wasn't the end of the story. She was the middle, and the beginning was much, much darker. The transition from the suburban sprawl of London to the industrial grey of Manchester feels like stepping back into a colder, harsher era. As Part 5 of the investigation surged forward, the detectives' echoes echoed through the archives of the Greater London and Manchester police. The photograph of the young nurse from 1974 had transformed a local tragedy into a national hunt for a phantom. Her name, discovered after 48 hours of frantic records matching, was Elena Vance. She had disappeared during a graveyard shift at a Manchester infirmary during the winter of 1974. At the time, her case was dismissed as a runaway. A young woman escaping the drudgery of the wards. But the strange fate on the back of Arthur's photo told a different, more sinister story. He had called her the one whom he taught to listen. The cold case was now bleeding across the map of England. Detectives traveled to the rain-slicked streets of the north, tracing Arthur's movements before he ever arrived at Blackwood Drive. They found that in the early 70s, Arthur Penhaligon wasn't a master carpenter. He was a maintenance worker at the very hospital where Elena Vance disappeared. He was the man with the keys, the man who moved through the vents and the basements, the man who lived in the literal walls of the institution. This was the concussion that hit the medical community. The realization that a predator had been facilitated by the very halls meant for healing. The mysterious disappearance of 1974 was no longer a cold file. It was a smoking gun. Back in London, the interrogation room had become a theater of the absurd. Arthur began to describe the acoustics of the hospital. He spoke about the way a scream sounds when it's muffled by 3 floors of industrial piping. He was no longer hiding behind a mask of normalcy. He was reveling in his sensational history. Elena was loud, he remarked to Detective Collins, his voice cracking with a dry, dusty chuckle. But she was the first to realize that no one is coming. People hear things, Sarah, but they choose not to listen. That was her gift to me. This level of shock within the police department led to a complete overhaul of how they viewed Arthur. He wasn't a neighbor who snapped. He was a scientist of suffering. The flow of evidence from the Manchester years began to reveal a terrifying pattern of hiding in plain sight. In 1974, Arthur lived in a boarding house less than 2 blocks from the hospital. When investigators tracked down the current owners of that building, they found that the basement had remained unchanged for decades. Behind a stack of rusted coal shovels, they find the open mystery of Elena Vance's life. Her nursing cap, her ID badge, and a stethoscope. Arthur hadn't just taken her life. He had taken her identity as a trophy. The DNA reveals killer headline was now being supplemented by the Manchester Monster, as the public realized Mary Higgins was just the latest chapter in a book written in blood. The witnesses from the Manchester era were few and far between, but those who remained told a chilling tale. A former head nurse remembered Arthur as the quiet man who always seemed to be fixing a leak whenever you needed to have a private conversation. He was a shadow in the periphery of their lives. The public shock in Manchester was a slow-burning fuse, igniting a fury that had been dormant for half a century. Families of other missing persons from the 70s began to descend on the police stations, demanding that their files be reopened. The cold case was a contagion, spreading through the history of the North, turning every unsolved label into a potential victim Arthur Penhaligon. The forensic teams in London were now working on the strange deposits found in the stethoscope from the Manchester basement. Using modern touch DNA analysis, they found skin cells that didn't belong to Elena. They belonged to a third, unknown person. The mystery was deepening. Was Arthur working with someone? Or was there a victim even earlier than Elena? The fast pace of the investigation was now a race against Arthur's failing health. He was 81. His heart was a ticking clock, and the Crown Prosecution Service was desperate to secure a full confession before the monster in the mirror took his secrets to the grave. The media coverage had reached a state of shock never before seen in the UK true crime landscape. Documentaries were being greenlit within hours of news breaks. Podcasts were dissecting the DNA reveals killer angle with surgical precision. But the real story remains in the silence of the evidence bags. The echo of the case was a heavy, suffocating blanket over the city. People were looking at their own basements, their own crawl spaces, with a newfound terror. The sensation was the realization that the infrastructure of our lives, the pipes, the wires, the walls, can be used against us by those we pay to maintain them. In the final hours of the fifth day, a breakthrough occurred in the mysterious disappearance of the third DNA profile. It matched a missing person report from 1971 in Birmingham, a young girl, only 19, who had disappeared from a bus stop. Arthur's work records show he had been a contractor in Birmingham that very summer. The cold case wasn't just London and Manchester. It was a trail of breadcrumbs leading across the heart of England. The emotional climax of this discovery was the sight of the lead detective, Sarah Collins, leaning against the wall of the precinct, her face pale, realizing the sheer scale of the evil they had finally unmasked. Arthur Penhaligon sat in his cell, a tray of untouched prison food in front of him. He looked out at the small patch of sky visible through the reinforced glass. He knew the DNA was his undoing, but he also knew the mystery of his life would never truly be solved. Even if they saw every body, they would never understand the why. The deadlock of the human mind was his final fortress. As the flow of Part 5 came to a close, the investigation prepared to move to Birmingham. The London 1985 cold case solved headline was now just a footnote in the saga of the most prolific, invisible killer the country had ever known. The mirror wasn't just in the basement anymore. It was reflecting the darkness of an entire nation. The search for Arthur Penhaligon's true origin didn't just move north. It descended into the forgotten, soot-stained ledgers of the West Midlands. As Part 6 of this unfolding nightmare begins, the cinematic lens shifts to the concrete brutalism of 1970s Birmingham. The DNA reveals killer headline was no longer a local London sensation. It had become a national autopsy of a lifetime of predation. The task force, now a massive multi-jurisdictional machine, took over a floor of a Birmingham precinct, fueled by the terrifying revelation of the third DNA profile found in Arthur's Manchester lair. This profile belongs to a ghost named Linda Voss, a 19-year-old factory clerk who disappeared on a foggy Tuesday in November 1971. The mysterious disappearance of Linda Voss has been a footnote in the city's history for over half a century. A case dismissed as a young girl seeking a brighter life in the city lights. But the truth was buried in a place no one thought to look. The very infrastructure of the city she called home. The cold case investigators began by mapping Arthur's employment records during his time in the Midlands. In 1971, Arthur wasn't the master carpenter he would later become. He was a junior technician for the city's public works department, specifically assigned to the maintenance of the underground pedestrian tunnels and bus shelters that dotted the city center. This was the strange behavior that sent a chill through the investigation team. Arthur had spent his days, and often his nights, in the subterranean veins of Birmingham. He knew the blind spots of the streetlights, the service hatches that bypassed locked doors, and the tunnels that everyone else used but never truly saw. He was a creature of the transit system, a predator who used the city's own movement to mask his stillness. The shock came when police realized that Linda Voss had last been seen at a bus stop just 300 yards from a service entrance Arthur had signed into on the night of her disappearance. In the interrogation room back in London, the atmosphere had shifted from academic to predatory. Arthur seemed to thrive on the mention of Birmingham. The fast, pounding rhythm of his breathing increased as Detective Collins laid out the photos of the 1971 bus stop. He didn't look away. Instead, he leaned in, his eyes narrowing with a terrifyingly sharp clarity. The buses were always late in the 70s, he remarked, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves on pavement. People wait. They get cold. They get tired. They look for a friendly face, someone with a key to somewhere warm. This wasn't a confession, it was a taunt. He was admitted to the mystery of his method, using the very vulnerability of the public to lure his victims into the darkness. The DNA reveals killer was the lock, but Arthur was handing them the key to his own depravity, one city at a time. The search for Linda Voss led the team to a decommissioned utility vault beneath the old Bull Ring district. This was the shock that would dominate the evening news. Forensic archaeologists, working by the light of portable halogens, found a space that had been meticulously prepared. It wasn't a grave, it was a cell. Behind a rusted iron door, they found a small, windowless room that Arthur had modified with soundproofing material from the early 70s. There were no remains, not yet, but they found a single blue plastic barrette, the kind a 19-year-old girl would use to pin back her hair. The DNA on that barrette was a perfect match for Linda Voss. The monster in the mirror had been building these nests across the country, turning the guts of the city into his private theater of cruelty. The community shock in Birmingham was visceral. The realization that thousands of commuters had walked over the site of a kidnapping for decades without knowing was a psychological blow that resonated through the streets. People began to look at the grate in the sidewalk and the service doors in the tunnels with a new, paralyzing fear. The flow of the investigation was uncovering a national network of trauma. Every city Arthur had touched was now a potential crime scene. The media began calling him the architect of shadows, a man who didn't just kill, but who designed the spaces where death happened. The cold case was no longer a tragedy. It was a systematic failure of urban safety. As the forensic teams began to dismantle the walls of the utility vault, they found the strange main they were truly dreading. Tucked into the insulation was a ledger, much like the one found in London, but older. It contained names that didn't match any known missing persons reports. The mystery was expanding beyond the reach of the police records. Arthur had been taking people who weren't missed, the drifters, the runaways, the people on the fringes of society. He had been a listener long before he met Mary Higgins. He was a collector of the forgotten. The fast, furious pace of the investigation was now a desperate scramble to identify these unrecorded victims before Arthur's heart gave out. The media frenzy reached a breaking point when a former co-worker of Arthur's from the Birmingham days came forward. The witness described a man who was obsessively helpful, someone who always volunteered for the late-night shifts in the tunnels because he liked the quiet. The witness recalled Arthur once saying that the city was like a human body, and the tunnels were the parts of the body that no one wants to think about. This sensational quote became the headline of every tabloid, painting a picture of a man who views himself as a surgeon of the urban landscape. The shock was the realization that Arthur's normalcy wasn't a mask. It was his camouflage. He was the perfect technician because he was the perfect predator. In the final hours of the Birmingham search, the ground-penetrating radar hit something deep beneath the floor of the vault. The emotional climax of Part 6 was the moment the floor was breached. They didn't find Linda Voss alone. They found the remains of two people, stacked with a chilling, geometric precision. The DNA reveals killer was about to confirm that Arthur Penhaligon was not just a serial killer, but perhaps the most prolific offender in British history. The open mystery of the second body in the vault sent the task force back to the records of 1969. The echo of the case was a tidal wave of grief, washing over 3 different cities, all connected by the hands of a man who trimmed his hedges and offered his neighbors tea. The investigation into the life of Arthur Penhaligon has now transcended the boundaries of a criminal inquiry and entered the realm of a historical excavation. As Part 7 begins, the narrative shifts from the brutalist concrete of Birmingham back to the scarred, gray landscape of post-war London, specifically the East End of the early 1950s. The DNA reveals killer headline that started this firestorm has now illuminated a path that leads all the way back to the cradle. The task force, exhausted but driven by a terrifying momentum, has begun to pull the records of a 10-year-old boy living in a city that was trying to rebuild itself from the ashes of the Blitz. The shocking community reaction has morphed into a collective shudder as the public realized that the monster didn't just move in next door. He grew up in the ruins of their own history. The cold case of Mary Higgins was merely the harvest. The seeds were sown in the rubble of 1952. To understand Arthur Penhaligon, the detectives realized they had to understand the world that made him. 1950s London was a playground of dangerous freedom for children. Bomb sites, half-collapsed warehouses, and streets filled with the dust of demolished buildings. It was here, in this landscape of fracture, that Arthur learned the art of invisibility. Investigators unearthed his primary school records from a damp archive in Tower Hamlets. The teacher's comments, written in fading ink, read like a prophetic warning that went unheeded for 70 years. Arthur is a quiet boy. One report from 1953 notes, he watches the other children play, but rarely joins in. He seems to prefer the company of shadows. Another entry, more chilling in hindsight, reads, Arthur has a strange lack of reaction to discipline. He stares. He waits. This strange manhood was there in black and white. A child who had already detached himself from the human herd. A boy who was learning to be a predator before he had even learned long division. The fast-paced, intense of the investigation focused on a specific event from the winter of 1952. A local boy named Timothy Evans, aged 9, disappeared while playing hide-and-seek in the labyrinth of a bombed-out textile factory. At the time, it was ruled a tragic accident, a boy who fell into a cellar or was buried under shifting masonry. His body was never found, but the modern-day task force, armed with the profile of Arthur's lifelong behavior, saw the pattern immediately. Arthur lived 2 streets away. He was known to play in that factory. He was the seeker who never had to count to 10 because he already knew where everyone was hiding. The open mystery of Timothy Evans was the first draft of the perfect crime. Arthur will be perfect over the next 7 decades. In the interrogation room, the dynamic changed once again. When Detective Sarah Collins placed the grainy, black-and-white school photo of Timothy Evans on the table, Arthur stopped smiling. For the first time, the mask of the kindly old neighbor slipped completely, revealing something ancient and cold. He didn't deny knowing Timothy. Instead, he spoke about the silence of the rubble. He described the post-war ruins not as a place of destruction, but as a sanctuary. The world was broken, Sarah, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the recording equipment. And in the broken places, you can do anything. No one looks at the dust. No one counts the bricks. This was the sensational moment that froze the blood of the listeners. The realization that Arthur viewed the devastation of war as a personal playground, a chaotic backdrop that camouflaged his own emerging darkness. The trauma was the understanding that he wasn't traumatized by the violence of the era. He was inspired by it. The investigation team, now working with historical surveyors, pinpointed the location of the old textile factory. It is now the site of a sprawling 1960s council estate, a concrete monolith built over the secrets of the past. The stalemate seemed inevitable. How do you search for a body lost in 1952 under a 10-story building? But Arthur's obsession with trophies gave them a lead. During the Birmingham dig, they had learned that Arthur never let go of the things he took. He didn't leave Timothy in the rubble. He brought a piece of him home. The focus shifted to the garden of Arthur's childhood home, a small terraced house that had been demolished and paved over to make a car park. The flow of the narrative moved to this mundane patch of asphalt in East London. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed again, searching for disturbances in the soil that predated the pavement. The media frenzy was now dissecting the psychology of the child killer. Psychologists and criminologists filled the airwaves, debating the nature versus nurture argument. Was Arthur born a monster, or did the violence of the Blitz create him? The community shock was particularly acute for the generation that grew up in the East End. They looked back at their own childhoods, at the games they played in the bomb sites, and wondered if they had ever crossed paths with Artie. The shocking feeling was a retrospective terror, the memory of a boy standing perfectly still in the dust, watching, waiting, calculating. The cold case was rewritten the collective memory of a generation. Under the gray sky of East London, the jackhammers broke through the asphalt of the car park. The emotional climax of the search was built. They weren't looking for a body. They were looking for a time capsule of sin, and they found it, buried 3 feet deep, encased in a rusted biscuit tin from the Coronation era. Was Arthur's first collection. The forensic team treated the news like an unexploded bomb. When the lid was finally pried open in the sterile environment of the lab, the contents told a heartbreaking story of stolen innocence. There was a bag of glass marbles, a slingshot made of ash wood, and a single, die-cast toy car. A red dinky toy double-decker bus. The paint was chipped, but on the bottom, scratched into the metal with a pin, were the initials T. Timothy Evans. The mysterious disappearance of 1952 was solved in a sterile lab 70 years later. Arthur hadn't just killed the boy. He had kept his favorite toy as a memento of the moment he crossed the line from human to something else. The strange transformation of the red bus was a devastating symbol. It represents the journey Timothy never got to take, the life that was cut short in the shadows of a broken wall. The discovery links the 81-year-old man in the cell to the 10-year-old boy in the rubble with an unbreakable chain of evidence. The DNA reveals killer. Headline was now irrelevant. This was about the soul of the killer. It proved that there was no good Arthur who turned bad. There was only the hunger, growing with him as he aged, evolving from toy cars to library books, from hide-and-seek to abduction. Back in the interrogation room, Arthur's reaction to the biscuit tin was the most chilling aspect of the entire investigation. He reached out, his handcuffed hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with a grotesque fondness. He touched the toy bus, threw the evidence bag. He was too loud. Arthur said simply, "He would have taken us away. The game requires silence." He was speaking about a murder committed 7 decades ago, as if it were a tactical decision made yesterday. The vibration in the room was palpable. Detective Collins realized she wasn't talking to a man who had snapped. She was to a man who viewed other human beings talking as obstacles to his own comfort, even at the age of 10. The monster in the mirror had been staring back at him since he was a child. The echoes of the case spread through the East End. A memorial service was planned for Timothy Evans, the boy who waited 70 years to be found. But the investigation wasn't over. The biscuit tin contains other items: a ribbon, a silver coin, a bird skull. Each item was a potential victim, an open mystery from the 1950s that had been forgotten by time but preserved by Arthur. The cold case had become a Pandora's box. The fast, furious pace of the task force slowed down to a grim, methodical crawl. They realized they were going to have to audit every unexplained child death in East London from 1950 to 1960. The scale of the task was overwhelming, but the necessity was absolute. The London 1985 cold case solved had become the key to a crypt of horrors that spanned the entire post-war history of Britain. Arthur Penhaligon was the dark thread running through the tapestry of the nation's recovery. While the country rebuilt, he destroyed. While the family reunited, he kept them apart. The impasse of the past was finally broken, but the floodwaters were black and full of grief. As Part 7 closes, the camera lingers on the rusted biscuit tin, sitting in the center of the evidence table. It is a small, insignificant object, but it holds the weight of a lifetime of evil. The boy who hid it there is now the old man waiting to die in prison, but the shadow he cast is longer than anyone could have imagined. The cold case has proven one thing above all else: evil doesn't age. It just waits. The narrative of Arthur Penhaligon now spirals into the turbulent, smoke-choked atmosphere of the early 1960s. As Part 8 begins, the investigation bridges the gap between the silence, watching child of the Blitz, and the calculated predator of the suburbs. The DNA reveals killer headline has opened a new chapter, one that focuses on the missing link in Arthur's evolution. Criminologists and detectives had long puzzled over a specific gap in the timeline between the childhood incident of 1952 and the Birmingham bus stop of 1971. Where did Arthur learn the tradecraft of death? The answer lies in the grease-stained records of a defunct auto salvage yard in Hackney, a place known in the neighborhood folklore simply as Vane's Yard. This was the University of the Monster, the Cold Case Unit, now tracing Arthur's employment history through the tax records of the swinging 60s. Discover that from age 16 to 22, Arthur was the sole apprentice of a man named Silas Vane. Silas Vane was a man of strange rumors. Strange rumors. He was a mechanic who could fix anything, but he was also known in the criminal underworld of East London as a man who could make cars disappear. He was a chopper, a stripper of stolen vehicles, a man who dissolved identity with acid and acetylene torches. For a teenage Arthur Penhaligon, Silas wasn't just a boss. He was a mentor in the physics of erasure, the investigation that reveals it was here, amidst the rusting carcasses of Triumphs and Fords, that Arthur learned the chemistry that would baffle police for decades. He learned how to clean a surface so thoroughly that not even a fingerprint remained. He learned how to dig a hole that wouldn't sink. He learned that if you take something apart piece by piece, it ceases to be a whole. It just becomes scrap. The shock for the detectives was the realization that Arthur's perfect crimes were essentially industrial processes applied to human beings. The open mystery of this era centers on Silas Vane himself. In the winter of 1964, Silas disappeared. The police reports from the time were sparse, listing him as a debt runner, a man who likely debt fled the country to escape gamblings. The case was closed almost as soon as it opened, but the modern-day task force, viewing the file through the lens of Arthur's history, sees the truth instantly. Silas didn't run. The apprentice had simply graduated. The flow of the narrative took the forensic team to the site of the old salvage yard, which had long since been paved over and turned into a commercial car wash. The irony was palpable. A place dedicated to cleaning was built on top of a history of filth. In the interrogation room, Arthur's transition shifted when the name Silas was mentioned. He didn't show fear or nostalgia. He showed disdain. Silas was a butcher. Arthur sneezed, his voice dripping with expert arrogance. He was messy. He liked the noise. He didn't understand that true disposal is an art form. It requires patience, not just a blowtorch. This sensational insight into Arthur's psyche reveals a terrifying ego. He killed his mentor not out of rage, but out of a sense of superiority. He believed he could do it better. He looked at Silas and saw a crude prototype of what he wanted to become. The cold case of Silas Vane wasn't a murder. It was a hostile takeover of a methodology. Arthur took Silas's tools, his techniques, and his philosophy, and then he removed the man himself from the equation. The excavation at the car wash was a logistical nightmare. The fast, pounding beat of the construction equipment breaking through the modern concrete echoes the violence of the past. The community shock was renewed as the local residents, who washed their cars there every Sunday, watched the police cordon off the area. They had been driving through a crime scene for 60 years. When the excavators finally reached the layer of soil dating back to 1964, they didn't find a body in the traditional sense. They found a 50-gallon oil drum, sealed with a level of welding precision that was ahead of its time. Inside was the mysterious disappearance of Silas Vane. But it wasn't just Silas. The drum contains the license plates of a dozen stolen cars, trophies of the business Arthur had helped destroy. It was a capsule of the 1960s criminal underworld, preserved in oil and darkness. The discovery of the drum confirms the DNA reveals killer theory on a new level. The welding on the drum matched the unique, erratic signature found on the metal box in Arthur's garage in Part 4. The fingerprint wasn't skin, it was the workmanship. The metal speaks the same language. The shock rippled through the forensic engineering community. They were looking at the work of a teenage prodigy of welding, a boy who used industrial skills to seal away his sins. The media dubbed this phase of his life the apprenticeship of iron, painting a picture of a young man forging himself into a weapon in the fires of a Hackney garage. But the salvage yard holds one more secret, a strange manner that will pivot the investigation toward its next terrifying chapter. Buried alongside the drum was a leather satchel, preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the soil. Inside were maps, not road maps, but geological survey maps of the British countryside, specifically the remote areas of the Peak District and the Yorkshire Dales. Marked on these maps were X marks in red ink. The dates scribbled next to them ranged from 1965 to 1969, the lost years where Arthur's employment records were spotty. The cold case team realized with a sinking heart that Arthur hadn't just operated in the cities. After disposing of Silas, he had taken his skills on the road. He had become a tourist of desolate places. The shocking feeling of seeing those maps was overwhelming. The police had always assumed Arthur was an urban predator, a creature of the concrete jungle, but the maps suggested he used the vast, empty landscapes of rural England as his dumping ground. The mystery of the hikers and campers who went missing in the late 60s suddenly had a horrifying new lead. Arthur Penhaligon, the man who lived next door, was also the man who camped alone in the moors. The echo of the case expanded to the national parks, the lonely laybys, and the silent hills. The monster wasn't just in the mirror. He was in the landscape itself. The interrogation of Arthur regarding the maps was a masterclass in manipulation. He looked at the red crosses and smiled, an emotional climax moment of pure malice. "The city is loud," he whispered. "Sometimes you need to go where the only witness is the wind. The earth in the moors is deep, detective. It holds secrets better than concrete." He was taunting them with the vastness of the search area. He knew they couldn't dig up the entire countryside. He had weaponized the geography of Britain against the police. The London 1985 cold case solved had now evolved into a hunt for needles in a haystack the size of a county. As Part 8 concludes, the image is one of profound isolation. We see the young Arthur, fresh from killing his mentor, driving a battered truck out of the smoke of London and into the green, rolling hills of the north. He is free, he is skilled, and he is hungry. The cold case has revealed that the quiet neighbor was once a nomad of death. The deadlock of the investigation is no longer about finding the suspect. It's about finding the victims scattered across the map like grim waypoints on a journey to hell. The garage in Hackney was where he learned to hide things. The moors were where he practiced. Key flow of the story moves from the fire of the welding torch to the cold mud of the wilderness. And the silence is deafening. The wind that howls across the Peak District is a living thing, a relentless, icy breath that scours the landscape of anything temporary. As Part 9 of the investigation opens, the claustrophobic brickwork of London is replaced by the terrifying vastness of the moors. The cold case has left the city limits. The investigation is no longer about urban camouflage or the secrets behind a locked door. It is about the silence of the horizon. The geological survey maps found in the grave of Silas Vane have become the Bible for a new specialized task force, a team of forensic anthropologists and mountain rescue experts who are hunting for ghosts in the heather. The red X mark scrawled by young Arthur Penhaligon are not just coordinates, they're tombstones. They represent the lost years of the late 1960s, a time when the monster in the mirror became a nomad, a predator who traded the noise of the East End for the desolation of the wild. The transition to the countryside reveals a chilling evolution in Arthur's methodology. In the city, he was a scavenger, using the infrastructure to hide his sins. But here, in the open air, he became a hunter. The strange mass of the maps indicates that he didn't choose random spots to bury bodies. He chose geological anomalies, sinkholes, peat bogs, and abandoned lead mines. He uses the earth itself as his accomplice. He understood that the moors were a place where people went to get lost, and he simply assured they never made it back. The shock for the rural communities of Derbyshire and Yorkshire was a slow creeping dread. For decades, they had told stories of the fog that takes people, of hikers who wandered off the path and disappeared into the mist. Now, they were realizing that the fog drove a Morris Minor and wore a wool sweater. The mysterious disappearance of the Sheffield Sweethearts, a young couple named David and Sarah who disappeared on a camping trip in 1966, was suddenly the primary focus of a manhunt that was 50 years late. The search for the Sheffield Sweethearts centered on a location Arthur had marked simply as the Chimney. It was a narrow, vertical fissure in the limestone rock face of a remote valley, overgrown with bracken and nearly invisible to the naked eye. The fast, furious pace of the operation was dictated by the weather. A storm was rolling in, threatening to turn the dig site into a mudslide. The team had to rappel into the darkness, suspended on ropes, descending into the throat of the earth. This wasn't a crime scene, it was an abyss. The sensation of the descent was palpable through the radio comms. As the lead climber reached the bottom, 60 feet down, his light fell upon a mound of debris that didn't look like rock. It was synthetic. It was the rotted remains of a bright orange canvas tent, preserved in the cool, dry air of the cave. The discovery of the tent was a time capsule moment that rivaled the house on Blackwood Drive. Inside, undisturbed for half a century, were 2 sleeping bags, a rusted camping stove, and a camera. The DNA reveals killer. Narrative was momentarily paused for a more immediate, heartbreaking identification. The film and the camera, miraculously developed by specialists using chemical restoration techniques, shows the last moments of David and Sarah. They were smiling, cooking beans over a fire, the landscape behind them vast and beautiful. And in the final frame, taken perhaps by accident, there was a figure in the distance, a man standing on the ridge, watching them, a man with a posture that was unmistakable. Arthur Penhaligon was haunting the background of their holiday photos, the Grim Reaper in a cagoule. The public shock when that image was released was a national trauma. It shattered the romantic ideal of the British countryside. The wild was no longer a place of escape. It was a hunting ground. In the interrogation room, Arthur's reaction to the photo was one of supreme arrogance. He didn't deny being there. He spoke about the purity of killing in the wild. In the city, you have to be quiet, he lectured, his voice raspy and devoid of emotion. You have to worry about neighbors, about the postman, about the smell. But out there, the wind takes the sound, the birds take the flesh, the earth takes the bones. It is the perfect system, detective. This sensational philosophy reveals that Arthur views his rural murders as a form of spiritual cleansing. He felt cleaner out there. He wasn't just disposing of Silas Vane's mess. He was refining his own craft. The cold case of the hikers wasn't a mistake. It was his vacation. The recovery of the remains from the chimney was a somber, grueling process. The flow of the investigation was heavy with the weight of 50 years of weather. But as the forensic team sifted through the sediment at the bottom of the fissure, they found something that linked the rural predator back to the urban hoarder. Wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a crevice in the rock wall was a small bundle. Inside was a collection of driver's licenses, not just David and Sarah's, But for others, the open mystery of the maps exploded in scale. Arthur hadn't just killed the couple. He had used the chimney as a central deposit box for a killing spree that spanned 3 summers. The strange grave of the red crosses on the map weren't individual graves. They were clusters. The moors were a graveyard, and he was the caretaker. The news of the driver's license cache sent shockwaves through families across the UK. People who had spent loved decades thinking their ones had run away to start new lives, or had fallen victims to tragic accidents, were now receiving calls from Scotland Yard. The echo of the case was a cruel reopening of wounds that had long since scarred over. The stalemate of never knowing was replaced by the horror of knowing too much. They learned that their sons and daughters hadn't left them. They had been taken by a man who saw them as nothing more than sport. The cold case unit was now managing a mass casualty event spread over time and space. The witnesses from this era were difficult to find, but the police managed to track down a former park ranger who worked the Peak District in the late 60s. He remembered a lonely young man who used to camp in the unauthorized zones. He never had much gear, the ranger recalled, his voice shaking as he looked at Arthur's mugshot. He just sat there. He didn't fish, he didn't hike. He just watched the trails. I told him to move along once, and he looked at me like I was the one intruding, like he owned the hills. That stare, the same stare that unnerved his teachers in the 1950s and his neighbors in the 1980s, was the consistent thread. Arthur Penhaligon was a man who believed he had eminent domain over life itself. As the Lost Hikers phase of the investigation concluded, the map of Arthur's crimes was almost complete, but there was one final, terrifying outlier. One of the red crosses on the map wasn't in the countryside, and it wasn't in a city he had lived in. It was marked on the coast, a seaside town called Margate, dated 1970. The notation next to it was different. It didn't say the chimney or the tunnel. It simply said, "The lesson." The emotional climax of Part 9 leaves the detectives staring at this final anomaly. The Moors had yielded their death, but the coast held a different kind of secret. Why Margate? And what lesson did a serial killer need to learn in 1970 that prepared him for the rest of his life? The DNA reveals killer's story had proven that science could catch a criminal, but it was the geography that told the story of the monster. From the bomb sites to the basements, from the tunnels to the peaks, Arthur had conquered every terrain he stepped on. The cold case was a tour of the British landscape through the eyes of a madman. As the helicopters lifted the remains of the Sheffield sweethearts out of the valley, the wind seemed to howl a little less fiercely, as if the land itself was finally exhaling a secret it had held for half a century. But the silence of Arthur Penhaligon remains absolute. He was done with the moors. He was thinking about the sea. The salt air of Margate does not preserve, it corrodes. As Part 10 of the investigation unfolds, the setting shifts from the ancient, stoic silence of the Peak District to the restless, gray churn of the English Channel. The year 1970 marks a pivotal, jagged scar in the timeline of Arthur Penhaligon. It is the year the nomads stopped moving and the neighbor began to take shape. The red cross on the geological map, marked simply the lesson, led the task force to a seaside town that, in winter, feels like a graveyard of summer memories. The shuttered arcades, the peeling paint of the Victorian boarding houses, and the relentless screaming of the gulls provide the backdrop for the most psychological phase of the cold case inquiry. Here, the detectives weren't looking for a masterpiece of concealment. They were looking for a failure. They were looking for the mistake that taught a monster how to be perfect. The strange clues of the Margate chapter began with a dusty file from the Kent Constabulary Archives, labeled Jane Doe, November 1970. Unlike the mysterious disappearance cases of the Moors, where bodies disappeared into the earth, this body had been rejected by the elements. A young woman, unidentified for 53 years, had washed up on the shingle beach beneath the iconic white rocks. At the time, the coroner's report was a catalog of errors. The investigation was botched, the evidence contaminated by the tide, and the cause of death listed vaguely as misadventure. But looking at the crime scene photos now, the London task force sees the signature of a developing predator. The ligature marks were messy, the disposal was panicked, and the location was exposed. This wasn't the work of the invisible man of Blackwood Drive. This was the work of a man who lost control. The shock hits the team when they cross-referenced Arthur's movements. In late 1970, Arthur Penhaligon wasn't working. He was staying at the Seaview Guest House, a crumbling establishment 3 streets back from the promenade. He had signed the guest book under his own name, a rare slip for a man who usually lived in the shadows. The cold case unit realized that Margate wasn't a hunting ground. It was a retreat. Arthur had come here to hide after the frenzy of the moors, but the hunger had followed him. The murder of Jane Doe wasn't planned. It was a compulsion that went wrong. This was the lesson. In the sterile safety of the interrogation room, the mention of Margate cracked Arthur's composure in a way the other locations hadn't. For the first time, he showed irritation. He looked at the photo of the beach and sneezed. "The sea is a traitor," he hissed, his voice trembling with a rare, genuine anger. "You give it a secret, and it throws it back at your feet. It has no loyalty. It has no silence." This sensational revelation was the key to understanding Arthur's psychology. He hated the chaos of the ocean. He hated the unpredictability of the tides. The lesson of 1970 was simple. Nature cannot be trusted to keep a secret. Only structure can be trusted. Only 4 walls, a locked door, and a concrete floor are permanent. Margate was the moment Arthur decided to stop being a wanderer and start being a homeowner. The investigation into the Jane Doe of Margate became a race to restore a name to the victim who changed history. Using the same DNA reveals killer technology that identified Arthur, the forensic team extracted a profile from a preserved sample of the victim's hair, kept in a pathologist's drawer since the 70s. The database pinged a match in a genealogy tree from the Midlands. Her name was Clara Miller. She was 22. A waitress who had come to Margate for the season and never came home. The public shock was a ripple of tragedy that spanned generations. Clara wasn't just a body on a beach. She was the catalyst for Arthur's transformation. Her death was the mistake that ensures Mary Higgins and so many others will never be found. Arthur learned from Clara that he needed a basement. The flow of the narrative took the detectives to the ruins of the Seaview Guest House, now a vacant lot scheduled for redevelopment. The fast, intense speed of the search wasn't for a body. Clara was already found, but for the trophy. Arthur never leaves a crime scene empty-handed. If he killed Clara, he took something. The open mystery was what he had done with it. He couldn't bury it in the sand. He didn't trust the ground here. He couldn't throw it in the ocean. The answer lies in the foundation of the guest house itself. During the demolition of the site, a construction crew found a loose brick in the old coal cellar. Behind it was a small, rusted tobacco tin. Inside the news was the shocking feeling that tied the clumsy murder of 1970 to the calculated terror of 1985. It contained a waitress's name tag, Clara, and wrapped around it was a receipt from a hardware store in Margate, dated the day after the murder. The receipt was for a spade, a bag of quick-drying cement, and a heavy-duty padlock. This strange Monty was staring them in the face. This receipt was the blueprint for his future. It was the shopping list of a man who was done with shallow graves and tidal washes. It was the moment he decided to build his own prisons. The media coverage of the Margate revelation painted a picture of a monster in transition. The public watched in horror as the timeline connected. The messy, chaotic violence of his youth, the Blitz, the scrapyard, the moors, the beach, ended in 1970. After Margate, the trail went cold for a decade. Why? Because he was preparing. The cold case investigation revealed that between 1971 and 1980, Arthur purchased his house in London. He spent 10 years renovating it. He dug the basement deeper. He thickened the walls. He installed the soundproofing. He was building the perfect trap that Clara Miller had taught him he needed. The lesson was patient. The echo of the case In Margate was a mass reckoning. The town, already struggling with its faded glory, now has to contend with being the incubator of a serial killer's methodology. A vigil was held on the beach, where Clara was found, a belated goodbye to the girl who was the failed experiment. But for the detectives, the realization was far darker. If Margate was the mistake that taught him caution, then the years between 1970 and 1985 weren't dormant. They were years of practice. The deadlock of the timeline was filled with the terrifying thought that there were other lessons learned in private. Inside the fortress of number 44, Blackwood Drive, long before Mary Higgins disappeared, as the sun set over the great English Channel, the lead investigator stood on the promenade, looking out at the water that Arthur ignored. The emotional climax of Part 10 was the understanding that the ocean had actually tried to warn them. It had rejected the killer's work. It had spat Clara back out as if to say, "Look at this. Stop him now." But no one looked closely enough. The Jane Doe file gathered dust, and Arthur Penhaligon moved to London, bought a house, and planted his roses. The tragedy of the cold case is not just the brilliance of the killer, but the blindness of the world. The final piece of the Margate puzzle came from a witness, a now elderly woman who had worked as a maid at the Seaview guest house. She reminded Arthur. She didn't remember him as a monster, but as a man who spent hours staring at the brickwork of the cellar. He used to tap on the walls, she told the police, mimicking the motion with a trembling hand. He was listening to the sound. He told me once, "A good wall doesn't talk back, love. A good wall keeps a secret forever." The DNA reveals killer was the science, but this quote was the soul of the man. He wasn't just hiding bodies, he was engineering silent. The London 1985 cold case solved had now come full circle. The journey had taken them from the house next door to the ends of the country and back again. They understood the how, the where, and the when. But as the team prepares for the final phase of the investigation, the final confrontation with Arthur and the closure of the Blackwood Drive site, they learn that the monster in the mirror had one last secret. The basement in London wasn't just a grave, it was a stage. And the final act was about to begin. The lesson of Margate was learned well. Arthur had built a masterpiece of death, and he was waiting for the applause. The floodlights at number 44, Blackwood Drive, were turned off for the first time in 11 days, leaving the street in a darkness that felt heavier than before. The fast, intense rhythm of the excavation had ceased, replaced by silence that was absolute and terrifying. As Part 11 begins, the forensic vans are packing up, their back doors closing on the final evidence bags. The London 1985 cold case solved headline has faded from the breaking news banners, replaced by a somber, national reflection. The investigation has come full circle, returning to the very spot where Mary Higgins's tea went cold 38 years ago. But the house standing next door is no longer a home. It is a mausoleum. The final discovery, made in the deepest recesses of the foundation, wasn't a body. It was the structure itself. The strange mound that baffled the structural engineers during the final days of the dig was the sheer density of the concrete in the basement floor. It was too thick, too reinforced for a residential terrace house. When they finally drilled through the last layer, they didn't find earth. They found a grid. Arthur Penhaligon hadn't just buried victims. He had incorporated them into the architecture. The shock that sickened even the most hardened homicide detectives was the realization that the supporting pillars of the house, the very beams that held up Arthur's living room, his kitchen, his bedroom, were cast around the mysterious disappearance of the last 40 years. He literally lived on top of his crimes. He walked on them. He slept above them. The perfect trap he learned to build after the mistakes of Margate was a house where the dead held up the living. In the interrogation room, Arthur sat for his final interview. He looked smaller now, the vitality of the cat-and-mouse game draining away as the reality of his confinement set in. But his eyes remained clear, fixed on the mirror on the wall, the two-way glass that separated him from the world he had deceived. When Detective Collins asked him the final question, how many? Arthur didn't give a number. He gave a philosophy. You count them as people, detective, he whispered, his voice a dry rattle. I count them as ballast. A house needs a strong foundation to weather the storm. I simply made sure mine will never shift. This was the sensational climax of the monster's narrative. A total, sociopathic detachment that viewed human life as nothing more than construction material. The cold case wasn't a tragedy to him. It was an engineering project. The SOC Songdong in Southwark has mutated into a form of collective PTSD. The neighbors who shared walls with number 44 are petitioning for their own homes to be demolished. How do you sleep knowing that the shared brickwork vibrates with the memory of a charnel house? The Kamjiak Chandong is the physical rejection of the landscape. The street has become a scar. Flowers are piled high against the police barricades. Not just red roses now, but lilies, sunflowers, and teddy bears. A chaotic, colorful tribute to the dozens of lives extinguished in the dark. The DNA reveals killer. Technology gave them names. Mary, Linda, David, Sarah, Clara, Timothy. But it couldn't give them back their stolen time. The dongche of their lives was dammed up by one man's greed for control. The Bienbo NGO of Arthur's motive was never truly solved. There was no trauma, no voice in his head, no grand delusion. There was only a void, a subitak of the soul. He killed because he liked the silence that followed. He killed because he wanted to be the only one who knew the secret. The tapes, the photos, the toys, the receipt for the cement, they were all just ways to relive that moment of total power. The monster in the mirror wasn't a demon. He was a narcissist of the highest order, a man who believed the world existed only to be engaged with on his terms, or removed entirely. As Arthur was transferred from the holding cell to the high-security psychiatric wing of Belmarsh Prison, a final image was captured by a long-lens camera. He was smiling. It wasn't a smile of joy, but of satisfaction. He had won the game. He had lived his entire life exactly as he wanted, right under the noses of the police, the public, and his neighbors. He had reached old age. He had drunk his tea. He had tended his garden. The punishment now meant nothing to him. He had already stolen the prize, a lifetime of freedom. The du Mqua Yuan is the bitter taste of justice arrived too late. The cold case was solved, yes, but the killer had already lived a full life. The final scene of this tragedy takes place back at Blackwood Drive. The decision has been made. The house will not be sold. It will not be renovated. It will be erased. As the heavy wrecking ball swings for the first time, crashing into the brickwork of number 44, the sound is deafening. Dust rises, a cloud of gray that chokes the air. It is the dust of 1985, of 1970, of 1952. It is the dust of the Blitz and the moors and the seaside. The Chow Treo Cam Suck is not of triumph, but of release. As the walls crumble, the mirror in the basement, the one Arthur used to watch Mary's window, shatters into 1,000 pieces. The reflection is broken. The monster is gone. But as the camera pans up, away from the rubble, away from the weeping families, and over the rooftops of London, a lingering thought remains. The city is vast. The rows of terrace houses stretch out for miles, a sea of slate roofs and chimney pots. Behind every curtain, there is a life. Behind every door, there is a secret. We tell ourselves that Arthur Penhaligon was an anomaly, a rare beast in a civilized world, but the London 1985 cold case has taught us a darker lesson. We never truly know who is listening through the wall. We never truly know what lies beneath the floorboards. The story of Arthur is over, but the silence he left behind, that will last forever. Good night, London, and lock your doors.